Hello, this is CIT253. It's a 3-hour course, data-driven web pages. We're in week 2, and this video is on JavaScripts. If you have any questions, please contact me at those numbers and telephone and email addresses. Okay, so why are we learning JavaScript? JavaScript's among the most powerful and flexible programming languages on the web. It powers dynamic web behavior on most websites. We're going to start with just the basic JavaScript before there was Ajax and HTML5 and all that kind of neat stuff, because that was the progression that technology built up in, and I think it makes more sense for you to understand client and server. So JavaScript's claim to fame, its basic JavaScript's claim to fame is it can change HTML content. Since almost all modern browsers support JavaScript, and it's a client-based. It runs on your browser. It doesn't, once it has its HTML content and its Java source code, everything's going to happen on the client end. Because it runs on a browser, and because so many browsers focus on covering so many different pieces of hardware, it's really client hardware agnostics. Originally you had code that would only run on an IBM PC or would only run on a Linux box or whatever. Because you're running in the browser, you really get disconnected from having to worry about the hardware almost always. Once a page is loaded, the basic JavaScript does not need to have an internet connection. And basic JavaScript has no lag waiting for the response from the server because it's doing everything in the browser. It has little or no way to store data though, and it has no way to access server data once the page is loaded until you get to Ajax, which we will talk about later, but at this point it has no way to access server data. Okay, and Ajax or HTML5 can connect to a server, and it's the future of how users will interact with computers, I believe. Okay, before we go any farther talking about JavaScript, we need to talk about the Document Object Model, or DOM. DOM is an object-oriented representation of the web page, which can be modified with a scripting language such as JavaScript. If you look at the DOM tree, you have a document, and you have the root element, then you have the element called head, and inside that you have a title and other values, and you have the body, and you have elements that you're going to identify, and you have types of elements, so all the H1 elements, you have specific text. This is, when we talk about DOM, this is what we mean. There's a lot of information on DOM out on the internet. I would suggest, if you're not comfortable with DOM, that you see JavaScript HTML DOM W3 Schools for more detail. They have one of the very best free, clear text on almost anything you want to find. They bring you from a low level to a high level, and many times as you move along the course, they give you ways to see source and to test and play with it. So if you have more questions, I would suggest you do that. This is a web video, I understand, but any place you can get access to this web video, or specifically at cwmclass.com, you can get the PowerPoint of this video, and therefore you don't have to worry about what the link behind that is. But if all else fails, Google JavaScript HTML DOM WW3 Schools. Okay, so JavaScript can change HTML content. That's the big deal. Here is an example. We're going to build, HTML, the browser is going to know it's hitting JavaScript because it's going to be between the script and end script tags. And here's some source code. The body, we've got the header 2. We've got an ID demo. It's a paragraph called ID demo, and there's the end of that paragraph. And then we get to the script, and the script says document, which was that DOM we talked about, get the element by ID demos. So it's going to be able to find this and use the inner HTML function and put my first JavaScript in it. That's the end of the script, end of the body, and end of the HTML. And if you put that, cut and paste or type that into your browser, you will find out that it works. And that's how simple JavaScript is. And if you want to see it, you can see JavaScript Introduction, W3 Schools, for more details. JavaScript display possibilities. You can display data in different ways. You can write it into an HTML element using inner HTML. You can write it into the HTML output using a document.write. You can write into the alert box with a window.alert. You can writing into the browser console using console.log. JavaScript statements are composed of values, operators, expressions, keywords, and comments. An example, this statement tells the browser to write hello Dolly inside an HTML element with an ID of demos. So we've got the document, which is how we access the DOM for this document. Get an element by ID, demo, enter HTML equals hello Dolly. JavaScript statements must end with a semicolon. If you've used any C or if you've done anything in Linux or Unix, you're familiar with white space, and white space is one or more spaces. And you can really help make something more readable by using white space. And JavaScript was written originally for early browsers with people who were coming from a Linux tradition, and so they used a semicolon to end a JavaScript statement. Many humans think a new line will end a statement. It doesn't in JavaScript. Semicolons separate JavaScript statements. Say that 3 times fast. Okay. So you can add a semicolon at the end of each executable statement. var a, b, c is going to create 3 variables. A equals 5 semicolon, b equals 6 semicolon, so that's 2 separate statements. The slashes are starting comments, but if we left off the semicolon, the browser would not be happy and you would not have a successful statement. Here's a demonstration to prove that new lines aren't required to get a new statement. A equals 5 semicolon, b equals 6 semicolon, c equals a plus b has exactly the same effect as those 3 right above it. Okay, and JavaScript's got something we called code blocks, and they start and end with curly braces. The purpose of a code block is to define statements that are executed together. Mostly, the most common place you're going to see it is JavaScript functions. An example is function my function, and then that would be what was passed into it. Start the block, end the block, and then what we're going to do in that function each time it's called. Okay, again, see the JavaScript Introduction for W3 Schools for more details. My goal in this class is not, I say again, not to teach you JavaScript if you've never been exposed to it, but it's critical for your success in this class that you have been exposed to it and feel comfortable with the syntax. If you don't, or if you have any questions, working through these tutorials from W3 Schools is a really great, fast way to get up to speed with a subject. Now, what is an example of a JavaScript HTML page? If you point your browser at http://us.stober.com/value, you will see a web page that is written purely in JavaScript. Now, a couple of things. Notice that I don't have an extension behind the value. That tells me, or I can predict, that that's in fact a directory on a web server, and that web server is set up so that it has some default program that's going to run in that or some file that's going to be served when that web server is asked to just give a directory listing for a directory. And in this case, the directory is value, and what it's going to do is run a program. That program is going to look like this, so that if we hit the enter key, we're going to get back HTML source. Later you're going to find out that we don't know for sure that this source exists exactly the way that we get it back on the web server. Next week we're going to talk about PHP, and on the outside we can't tell whether PHP generated the code or whether it's a static page that's just given to us. Because I know the history of this page, I know, or I don't believe, at least in 2016 when I left, it did not have any PHP generation, but instead it was a purely static page with JavaScript in it. When you run it, this is what you see, which is value stands for visual accounting of lower utility expenses. Stober makes gearboxes. Stober gearboxes are really very efficient because of the helical gearing and high precision bearings and the quality of the workmanship and so forth. This was to help customers understand that they should not just compare the purchase price of the Stober gearbox to the worm gear that they may have been using from a competitor. Iron gearboxes were typically 98% efficient in gearing, whereas many worm gears are 50% efficient, which this program was to help them help users understand exactly how much it was costing them to run a cheap, inefficient gearbox. So the user would come in and tell how many horsepower they needed. The Stober gearbox efficiency, typically 98%, what their competitor's gearbox was, maybe 50%, but whatever it was, they could fill it in. What were they paying per kilowatt hour? At the time that this code was written, it was typically about 10 cents in this area, but they can fill in whatever blank they want. How many hours a day, how many days a week, and how many weeks a year did they run? And how many hours did they operate a day? Then when they push this calculate button, it comes back and calculates all this. It does it purely on JavaScript code that's all running in the browser. Advantages were that a salesman could be parked in his car someplace where he did not have internet connection, or he could be in the lunchroom of a plant where he didn't have internet connection. And once he had this page loaded, he didn't have to connect back to Stober. And it was quite useful in helping us sell gearboxes. Now, if you want to see the code that's behind that, I recommend using Chrome. In fact, I use Firefox most of the time because of security, but when I'm doing web page programming, I found Chrome to be the best. Your mileage may vary, so you ought to use whichever one you like. I'm just telling you what works for me. So you can come in and save page as, and save this page locally so that you can see the source code behind it. Or if you just want to pull it up on the screen, and many times this is good. You're going to find out that this is a fairly sophisticated page, but you can come into Developer on the Chrome, View Source, and we'll see what it does. If you're debugging really sophisticated JavaScript, we'll come back later and talk to you about pulling up developer tools where you can watch a lot more about what's happening. Alright, so the top of the code for this program looks like this, and I'm certainly not going to go down every line and talk to you about it, but while it's got a lot of beautification on it and so forth, it's really at its heart a fairly straightforward program. What we're going to talk to you about is the code that the web server generated to fill a request. When you look at the page source, it doesn't mean that that source is sitting on the web server someplace. It means that after the Apache web server followed all your instructions, as far as PHP and so forth of the person, it generated this HTML code and sent it out to your browser. Okay, if you downloaded the file and then look at it, at line 625 to 627, you're going to see this. Now, in fact, this is line 625 and this is line 627, and all of this is line 626. I put these carriage returns in so that it was more readable, particularly on trying to do it on a PowerPoint presentation. But you can see that it says that there is an input type button, and when we get the advent of onClick, we're going to file this form, a horsepower total.value. So we're setting the value of horsepower total equals to a function make horsepowers. We're going to pass this form to it so it can get to all the variables, and then we're going to have these values when it comes back that we're going to load and fill in the values to put back on the screen. It, in fact, and if you look at the program you downloaded, when I saved it as value, and you're going to see that you also have a directory beside the HTML that is whatever you called it, and it's a folder, and in that folder is going to be Savings.js. This is Savings.js. It's here, and then it wraps around to here. So we're saying, well, if we get function make horsepower and the form value, then we're going to set horsepower equals this form that we passed in, the variable horsepower value. Efficiency is going to equal the form's efficiency value divided by 100, and we're going to return the horsepower divided by efficiency to two places. So while the form looks fairly sophisticated, it's not a really complex formula. We also have a way to make kilowatt hours, and so horsepower is equal to the horsepower total value, and return horsepower times 0.762 to two places, which is the function that gets you back to kilowatts, and so forth. So I'm not going to run through all this, but in fact what we're showing you here is a browser-based program. You know, your computer's got way more power than they had in the computers that put the man on the moon. So why should you sit there and let it act like it's a dumb browser? Use some of that computing power, get the speed, and so forth. The disadvantage is that you can't, until you go to Ajax, pick up anything new. You've got to go with what you got on your first page load. And there's really no good way to store stuff, particularly no way to store stuff back at the server But if all you're doing is working on local values and people are prepared to just print screenshots and so forth, it's a really simple way to do a lot of powerful things. Okay, so that was kind of a quick overview of JavaScript. It's for CIT253. Really, I gave you a couple of places you can go get more information. If you have questions, please contact me during office hours, and I will certainly be glad to set up a GoToMeeting with you so we can talk through any questions and so forth. I hope this helped, and if you have questions, please contact me. Thank you.